This is basically a summary of the past 8 years, what we did in this so-called Center for Perspicuous Computing that you may have heard about in the last few DL workshops. And yeah, it's about explaining description logic reasoning. And before I go into the formal details, I first want to present the team that we were working with, spanning different areas like logical reasoning, of course, but also human-computer interaction and natural language generation that we were working together in this center. They were distributed all over Germany, basically from one end in Dresden to the other end in Saarbrücken. And sometimes when the way was too far, we just met in the middle in Bad Hersfeld to have some nice collaborations there. Yeah, that's basically the summary. You may recognize some of the faces here sitting today as well. And there were also a lot of student assistants that are by now, some of them already PhD students in other projects. So this has been going on for a while. And this will be basically just a short summary of everything, at least most of the things that I was involved in the center. So if you want to know any details, you have to look at the papers or ask me afterwards. This is just going to be an overview here. So we are interested in explanations, and for us as logicians, this mainly means proofs, but also other kinds of explanations. Proofs basically like this weird graph here. I will explain a bit more in a minute, but you are kind of familiar, I hope, with the concept. But then there are also these human-computer interaction people involved, right? We want to enable people to actually inspect the proofs, and there will be some interaction involved that allows people to kind of focus on different parts of the proofs and interact with them. So this is during inspection time when you kind of have a long time to actually look at the proof and deeply understand it. But then there are also other scenarios where at runtime you need to quickly explain something to a human user, and that's where the natural language generation comes in. Yeah, the drone that kind of detects some obstacle and doesn't know how to continue needs to communicate to the person responsible what's going on so that they can take action. So that's basically what this project is about. And now the outline of my talk is as follows. So most of the time I will be talking about these proofs, and we are going to see the details in a minute. Then a little bit also on missing entailment. So what happens if something doesn't have a proof because it's not entailed. And in the end, I will also talk about user studies that we did for evaluating how to present proofs to people, and this verbalization task where we take proofs and try to distill them down to kind of a better understandable summary of what's going on. Okay, so first the first part. So this you should all know, but what we did is not necessarily restricted to only description logics, although we did it in the description logic context, of course. So we have a T-box or a logical theory in some logic, whatever you want to call it. This is just a finite set of some formulas. And we have an entailment that we're interested in, this orange alpha here, that follows from the T-box in some way. That is a consequence. And we want to explain how this consequence came to be. And the classical way to explain this, very successful, is these justifications, where you just point out the three, in this case, axioms from the T-box that led to the consequence, or any minimal set of such axioms. In different fields, yeah, these have different names, for example, MUS or minimal conflict sets or Y provenance, but this is a very common and popular approach to explanations. And if you look at this in the DL context, this was basically what was there when we started. In the ontology editor Protégé, you also have this facility to extract justifications. If you have a large biomedical ontology, in this case, you can get the 11 axioms that are responsible. But as you see, if you're not very familiar with the ontology, it may already be hard to parse just a single axiom and then putting together all these different axioms in the right order. I mean, there's already a kind of structure here that this justification plugin was inducing. Yeah, you're kind of seeing an order to these axioms, how they are supposed to be applied. So there was already a recognition of the need for a bit of structure, a bit of more structure to this justification. Especially, yeah, as I say here, so if there's a complex reasoning chain involved, or you are just a novice, you're not familiar with the ontology, or you're not even familiar with OWL, then you need some more support, maybe. And also related to this natural language generation aspects, we found that if you have only justification, this is sometimes not enough information to generate a nice explanation out of it. And that's why there actually already was a proof plugin in the ontology editor Protégé, which was based on ELK, developed by Evgeny Kazakov and co-authors, that nicely showed this kind of proof trees. So where you say, okay, what is my entailment that I want to prove? This is at the root, and then I can kind of step by step explore how this entailment came to be by just looking at the intermediate steps that ELK did, not just the parts from the ontology, but all the steps in between that are here in yellow. And at some point, if you go deep down enough, then you will end up at the ontology axioms. But in this way, you have kind of simpler steps. You only have to look at like 2 or 3 axioms at a time, and then it is a bit simpler, at least, to figure out how this happened. Of course, the proof is in general larger, and you will have to spend more time to read everything, but hopefully it is easier to do on average. So that's why we were looking at proofs here in this project for most of these 8 years. So what is a proof? For us, a proof is a hypergraph. What kind of hypergraph? So it's a kind of specific directed hypergraph between the premises of an inference step that you can make. So here we have one inference step with 2 premises and 1 conclusion. There's always just 1 conclusion, and the direction is kind of going to the conclusion. And in this kind of directed hypergraphs, proofs can be formalized as being acyclic. Of course, you don't want to have cyclic steps in your proof, and non-redundant, meaning that you don't derive the same thing twice. So you just want to have a compact way of explaining what happened. And of course, the sink should be the entailment that you're interested in. And then when we are studying this problem of finding good proofs, we had the problem of formalizing what is a good proof, or what is even an inference step, because in general there are infinitely many possible inferences that you can do starting from an ontology. You can derive lots of things. But we kind of have to focus on the things that actually lead us to our conclusion. And this is kind of the job here of the so-called derivation structure, which collects all the admissible inference steps. Now, what are admissible inference steps? That depends on your logic, that depends on your reasoner. You could, for example, get these from a consequence-based calculus where you have a fixed set of rules that specify what are the admissible steps. And then usually given a T-box and an entailment, this reasoner will produce, well, not just a yes or no answer, but internally it will basically apply these reasoning rules, and these are then our admissible inference steps. This is the part in gray. So these are kind of all possible steps that the reasoner could take, and out of all of those, we want to find the best ones, let's say. Find the optimal proofs in this gray derivation structure. And then again, we have to define what is optimal, what does optimal mean. And this is not very easy to characterize, right? What is a easy to understand proof? For the most part, we were focusing on simple measures on the proof, for example, the size Here we have 5 nodes in this green proof. It's just the number of axioms involved, including the intermediate ones, of course. Then there's the tree size that we looked at, where we think, okay, normally if you represent a proof, you have a tree-shaped structure, so you're not allowed to do structure sharing like this. So you would have to count this node twice, actually, if you want to show it, for example, in this Protégé plugin, then the tree size goes up to 6 in this example. Or we could look at the depth of the proof, which is 2 here. You have 2 kind of steps from a leaf to the sink. And many different other measures, for example, also justification size that basically just counts what are the leaves of the proof, so kind of corresponding to the justifications in the T-box. And then, yeah, this was basically the first thing that we did. We built a big complexity table out of it. And as I said, I cannot explain everything here. So the problem that we are looking at is in this derivation structure, is there a proof with a measure, so size or tree size or whatever, smaller equals some threshold. So you can think about this as kind of trying to minimize the size or the tree size. And then we looked at many different measures and some general classes of measures that we called phi measures, which include basically all of the examples that I've told you about. And in general, these phi measures, we could have some generic upper bounds by basically just saying, okay, you can just guess a proof in the derivation structure, and then depending on whether the size of the derivation structure is polynomial, like in EL, or exponential, like in other logics, in more expressive logics, you get an NP or NX time upper bound. And here there's also distinction of unary and binary encoding of this number p that sometimes makes a difference. And for specific measures, we were able to show, okay, sometimes it gets better. So if we have, for example, a size bound given, then if it's encoded in unary, then this complexity here drops to NP, but in general, in binary, it still stays NX time hard. And we also identified a nicer class of measures that are more well-behaved, let's say, because they're kind of more deterministic. So these we called monotone recursive phi measures, where the idea is basically you can compute the measure locally by just looking at one inference and the measures of the subproofs, and you can basically just go through this through the proof recursively without having to consider the whole structure of the proof at once. And there, basically, you can use a kind of shortest path algorithm, so shortest hyperpath algorithm in this case for these hyper graphs, and we show that the complexity drops to p and x time respectively. And again, for some of these measures that are of this family, we can have even better complexity bounds. Now, the next thing we studied was how to actually compute proofs. Okay, now we kind of know the theoretical complexity, but in the end, we want to show proofs to people in Protégé, for example. And yeah, as I said, you can basically use either consequence-based reasoners that internally already use this kind of predefined set of inference steps. But there are also many other approaches. So for example, justification-oriented proofs that basically start from the justification and then try to add intermediate steps by some heuristics, or concept interpolation, where if you want to prove that A is subsumed by B, you try to find an intermediate step in the middle that gives more information, hopefully, about the reason. And something that we developed together in Dresden and Patrick implemented basically based on his idea that you can use forgetting to construct proofs. And there the idea is that you start with the original ontology, T0, and then you try to forget all the symbols of the ontology until all you have left is just the original or the symbols that are in the entailment that you want to explain. So here in this case A and B, you remove step by step all the other symbols, and what this does is basically construct a sequence of ontologies that get coarser and coarser, and in the end only retain the information that you have A subsumed by B. But there's a kind of entailment relation that you can now follow from each of those ontologies to the next. So you can then reconstruct a proof from this structure, which is very nice because it works whenever you have a forgetting tool, even if you don't have a consequence-based reasoner for the logic. For example, then it also works for ALCOI, some of these tools, and ALCH. Yeah, and then you can extract proofs that basically look like this. So on the right side, we have this forgetting-based proof where we're starting from two axioms in the ontology. It says A subsumed by exists RB, and the domain of R is B. And then by just forgetting R, basically all that remains is that A is subsumed by B, which you wanted to prove. So in this case, the proof is very short. It's just one step. And if you're familiar with the semantics, this is probably enough. On the other side, this is the proof generated by ELK, which has to basically follow these rigid inference steps. And then you do first an existential filler expansion. You start with a tautology, then you expand to existential restrictions, and you need to translate the domain axiom also into existential restrictions, and at the end you arrive at the same conclusion. And we kind of compared these proofs over many different examples. We were looking at the ORE 2015 benchmark set for ELH. We filtered for ELH ontologies. And then we compared these different methods. And here, for example, you see, as we have seen on the previous slide, the size of the proof is generally smaller if you look at these elimination proofs. And ELK often has to do more, but simpler steps. If you look at tree size, this is a bit more mixed. So there you have to basically count multiple nodes several times, one node several times sometimes, and then it's generally still, in most cases, smaller, but sometimes it can also blow up a little. And then we also looked at another measure that I haven't mentioned yet, but it's quite interesting because it kind of tries to measure the cognitive complexity of the proofs. And this is based on a measure that was developed for justifications already in 2013. And they also did user studies about that and tried to validate that the really larger numbers kind of correspond to higher complexity. And here we kind of applied these measures to proofs by just measuring each step independently. And then this is what we call the justification complexity. And there we had a much more also diverse picture where kind of sometimes the elimination proofs are easier and sometimes the ELK proof, but it's not a clear advantage of one over the other. And this we will also see in many other of these results now. So it's generally not the case that one method is always better than another. Here is also an interesting comparison that we then did on this benchmark set of comparing the justifications to the proofs. In case you are wondering what is the relationship between the justifications. Here we have justifications up to size 25. And then the proofs, of course, they are larger in general. So often they are double the size, sometimes 4 times even. But okay, not exorbitantly larger. On the other side, the step complexity, or at least the average step complexity, if you look at the whole proof and just average over how complex is each step, here you see that justification complexity itself can go up to 1,400, but the step complexity in the proofs is basically less than 500. So each of the individual steps in the proofs that we do is easier, which kind of validates our original intuition that having more steps makes it easier to understand, although of course now you have to deal with more axioms. Okay, then what we also did now is basically a series of slides on different papers of extensions of this approach. First thing we looked at was ontology-mediated queries. So we have some conjunctive queries or other kinds of queries as well that are entailed by a T box and an A box. And then the approach that we followed to explain these was basically to look at a chase structure generated by the ontology, yeah, and then try to reconstruct the order and the connections between the individual pieces of information in this chase structure that follow from specific axioms. Here we wrote them in a scholemized form because we have to give some names to these domain elements in the chase. And then from that we were able to basically, so this green part with the dotted arrows is then basically a proof if you then again unfold it to be a tree. I didn't do that here, but basically if you follow this, that this leads to the conclusion that yeah, all the green parts, the R connection here and the D from the query are satisfied. Another complexity table that unfortunately I cannot really explain in detail in this time. We are looking at different yeah, Horn description logics here and different query languages and try to characterize how hard it is to find these proofs. Here we also have the domain size, so how many elements of the chase do I need to use to explain the consequence that we could also try to minimize. And we found out that, okay, yeah, the proofs can unfortunately get very large in expressive logics. Another extension that we did was with concrete domains that Barish already mentioned, that I have also been interested in, have been doing some things from time to time. So concrete domains in this setting here, they are quite interesting. For example, you can have linear equations over different quantities, but restricted in the sense that you can only talk about the quantities of one individual. So there are no feature paths if you know what they are. If you don't worry about it. And this basically means that you can abstract away the concrete domain part and just replace the concrete domain expression by a new concept name. And then you just have to kind of enrich the ontology a little bit by consequences that follow from the concrete domain about these abstracted concept names. So for example, there are 3 concrete domain constraints, alpha, beta, gamma, and alpha and beta together imply gamma. And then you just have to add that to the ontology to enable you to prove something in this combined logic. But then, of course, this abstracted view is not really an explanation of what happened. You still have to combine it somehow with the alpha, beta, and gamma that are actually there in the concrete domain. For example, here we have 2 linear equations that through some modifications you can show basically just linear combinations in this case to entail a third one. And this is kind of the concrete domain part. And then we figured out a way to combine these together in a general way so that every proof that is on this abstract level can then again be made more concrete, where you have the both components in one structure. So this is something I wasn't really very much involved in, but I also want to mention it because it's also part of the Center for Perspicuous Computing. So Markus Kreutsch and his group looked also at basically tracing the reasoning process of their new engine NeMo for data log and existential rules. And they even support negation and aggregation in these rules, which is very interesting for applications. And we used this engine in the end to again do something with DLs. Maybe you remember if you were at DL last year, I already talked about this, that this allowed us to basically implement different calculi for EL, different consequence-based rule sets in this rule engine NeMo, and then use those proofs to reconstruct DL proofs. And now we can just compare quite easily different proofs generated by different sets of rules in this way. And then we find out, for example, the that the proofs from the calculus from the introduction to DL textbooks are generally of higher step complexity, but they have lower depth, for example. Again, for the details, you have to ask later or look in the paper. And now the last thing I want to mention in this regard is that we also did something in temporal. Another thing that Baruch mentioned earlier, that I'm interested in temporal rules, basically data log MTL. This reasoner Meteor was developed for data log MTL, and then we extended this by basically allowing to trace the materialization process in Meteor that allows us to give some reasoning that will become relevant later for this drone use case that I showed earlier. For example, here we have some rules related to some sensor data in the drone, and then we also have some temporal operators that tell us when certain things occur, and the reasoning process in Meteor then and these proofs have to take into account these temporal operators like this box here, for example. Okay, that's the part about proofs. Now let me quickly go through the missing entailments, because again, this is not something I was very much involved in, but it will become relevant later in the talk. So this is also an important question. So what do you do when the entailment doesn't follow from the ontology? Yeah? You can, for example, show a counterexample, a model of the T-box that does not satisfy alpha, which may, however, be quite large, depending on the T-box. Or you can follow abduction, something that Patrick and other people have been doing. So you try to find a set of axioms that you can add to the ontology to make the entailment hold, and that set hopefully explains why it didn't follow in the first place under some constraints of not trivializing this process. And the first thing, there's an approach developed also in Dresden by Christian and Willi that basically says, okay, we want to have a counterexample, but we don't want it to be too large because the people will still have to look at it and try to understand it. And then they try to identify some criteria under which you can kind of restrict the part of the model that you have to show in different ways. Again, I cannot give many details here, but basically trying to identify the parts of the model that really are relevant for the entailment and just leave out the stuff that is not really useful there, so you can really focus on the part that you want to explain. And yeah, for this abduction approach, there are also different methods that exist. For example, the ones that we used in the end were based on Patrick's work on complete signature-based abduction, where the idea is that you restrict the hypothesis to a signature to make it not trivial, for example, by just allowing the hypothesis to contain the entailment itself. This has a relatively high expressivity, so you can have ALC ontologies, you can have the very expressive hypotheses. And this was also implemented. This other thing here, which he also did, was also implemented. It's called connection minimal abduction, where the idea, well, there's no signature here, but the idea is that the hypothesis has to be connected to the entailment in some way to make it relevant for explaining alpha. This only works in EL, and the hypotheses can only be conjunctions of concept names. But again, there is an implementation which is relevant for the next part of my talk, which is basically a short non-commercial break. So if you want to know more about this tool that we developed, look at the video, which is very nice. It basically explains what this is about. I will just give you a few screenshots now because I don't have much time to show the whole video. But it's very nice video, I think. And yeah, basically this is about a series of Protégé plugins that we developed with all the techniques that I just mentioned. Basically, we have different ways of showing proofs from different techniques. We have counterexamples, again, different algorithms that you can choose there. As I said in the beginning, there's not always just one best method of explaining, but you can choose the one that you like most. And we also support this abduction task where we say, okay, we can kind of specify a vocabulary and then out from the hypotheses that are generated by the abduction solver. Something that, again, I was not involved in, but part of this larger family is Evee. This is the bigger sister of our plugins, which was developed in cooperation with these human-computer interaction people, where you have a kind of more nice visualization and also interaction methods to kind of compress and expand the proofs however you like to explore them. This is Evee, yeah, and it even supports also these concrete domain things that I showed you earlier. So with linear equations, you can have nice visualizations there, trying to explain why some equations don't have a solution or why some equations follow from another one. And last but not least, no, it's actually not last, but definitely also not least, is the Nemo engine that I have mentioned before. This is also, as I said, very interesting, works with data log and with aggregation, existential rules, and also features some nice visualizations of the reasoning process. So if you want to understand why something followed from your program. And then these are just two last QR codes if you want to scan them, but you can also look them up in the papers, of course. So there's a thing about data log MTL and concrete domain part. We don't have nice screenshots of those because it's basically just the reasoning components right now, but we are also working on integrating this into Protégé in the future. Okay, commercial break over. Now you have to pay attention again, but not very long because I'm just going to give a quick overview of these last few parts, and the details will be given by Alisa later today. So this is a kind of shameless way to extend the time that I have for my talk. But yeah, this is, I don't have so much time to talk about many details here. As I said, we did some user studies to try to find out what is a good way, what is the best way to present the proofs to the users, for example, like in Evee or maybe in a more traditional format. We tried different formats of proofs, and I will show some of them in a second. But the general gist is that we cannot really draw very big conclusions. Usually people prefer shorter proofs, of course, because who wants to spend so much time to understand the complex proofs? So if you can compress your proof, it's usually better. They prefer tree-shaped proofs rather than text-based proofs, for example, and interaction is always a good idea because then you can tailor the visualization to your needs. But as I said, so preferences are subjective. So different people prefer different proofs. In general, there's not just one best method to show that. There was also another user study, and as I said, Alisa will report about more of that, where we check the usability of our Protégé plugins with actual ontology engineers and students who were working with Protégé before. And again, the preferred method of explanation kind of depends. Yeah? Depends on the user and the use case that you want to solve. But since we support so many different methods, I hope there's something for everyone in there. Yeah, in these user studies, we were basically, as I said, trying different formats of proofs. For example, if you don't have experts in description logic syntax, you can try to just write a text out of the proof with some templates, for example, or you can show them in a more classical way where you have to kind of abbreviate the concept names because otherwise it would get much too large. Or you can show this in this kind of DAG fashion, where you can also allow to reuse nodes, or you kind of try to linearize the text to make it easier to follow the structure a little bit. Or as I said, we also did some studies with these Evee-based proofs, where you can also interact with the. But yeah, there are many different methods. Not one of them is kind of the best method for evaluating this. And as I said, you can hear more from Alisa in 45 minutes in our DL paper. Now the last part on verbalizations. How much time do I have actually? I still have my minute. Okay. Is about this use case that I mentioned in the beginning on the drones, where we kind of have to, with the drone encounters a problem, and then there's a human operator involved. There always has to be a human overseer to an autonomous system. So if something goes wrong, that they can take over. And yeah, basically this requires you to communicate what went wrong and communicate the description of the current situation of the drone in a relatively short amount of time. And yeah, a very good medium for that is a verbalization, where you can just talk to the person involved and explain what happened. And there are different approaches to do that, ordered by basically time. And you can imagine what comes at the end nowadays. So there are controlled natural language approaches to do that, or template-based verbalization also developed here in our community, for example. Then we started to look into transformer models, and lastly, of course, into large language models to try to communicate these proofs. Yeah, as I showed you some examples earlier, they can be quite large, so we cannot really go through each step in the proofs. That would take hours. We just have a few seconds, so we really need to figure out what is the best part, or what is the most important part of the proof. And there we've also found out that proofs really provide more information, more context for these automated methods to work well. Because if you just give it to these two axioms at the leaves, then sometimes this is not enough information about the reasoning process behind what went wrong. I mean, this is still a relatively small proof, or this is maybe fine, but if they get larger, then this gets more complicated. And the challenge, as I said, is to find which part of the proof is the crucial step, kind of, or which parts of the sensor data are the important pieces of information, for example. And this is still challenging. You can, as you probably know from LLMs, you can get inconsistent outputs. You can get different proofs at different times of the day. You can get hallucinations, that they just invent something that, for example, here, it just invented a reason that this is likely because the drone is flying, which has nothing to do at all with the actual situation. Of course, the drone is flying. I don't care about this part of the explanation, and so on. But again, the details of this you will hear from Alisa in 60 minutes, roughly, if I'm not mistaken, on this approach. Yeah, okay, that already brings me to the last slide. So in summary, I can say basically for explanations, justifications are often enough. They are already very good in pointing out the parts that are going wrong. But sometimes if it's more challenging to explain, or if you have novice users, then you need more information, you need simpler steps. On the other hand, if there's some entailment that is missing, so that you expect it to hold but doesn't follow from your ontology, then these missing entailments also require explanations, and there are also techniques to deal with that. Unfortunately, I mean, some of these techniques can also take very long. So if you really want to have a detailed proof and don't have an efficient consequence-based procedure for your logic, for example, then of course it can also take much longer than just computing the justifications. But for example, in this data log MTL setting with the drones, so this is relatively fast, as we only recently found out experimentally that this actually works in a few, in less than a second usually to compute the proof. And then of course you still have some time to generate the natural language explanations. But this works quite well actually. And yeah, from the user studies, basically the takeaway is that these kind of formal explanations are still only useful for experts that really know the logic and not really for users. So there's still quite a lot of work that we have to do to kind of bring this to end users that are not familiar with DLs, and there this natural language generation is a kind of first approach. So in future work, as I said, we want to extend also our Evee library with concrete domains, for example, that we already developed. I mean, the reason is already there. We just need to integrate it into Protégé. And of course, in the longer term, kind of the overarching goal that still remains is to how to explain logics to lay people. This is yeah, a very challenging task. Okay, thank you for listening.